I'm Dr. Caitlin Kite from the University of Exeter, and this is a recording of the session called Exploring Positionality Through Self-Study, which was originally presented at the 2022 Decolonization Festival hosted by the University of Exeter. This recording captures the original content and activities from that session and even incorporates some contributions from the original participants. It was designed as a really interactive session, and I have left the activities in so that you can participate with them in your own time. If you'd like to do that, you can just pause the video to engage with the activities and then return and unpause when you're ready to move on. Here is a brief plan of the session. So first we're going to start by thinking about what the self is and what it's like to be you. And that will lead us on to an exploration of the idea of positionality, and that will finally culminate in actually being able to dive in and think about self-study and positionality through experimenting with a selection of self-study methods. And at the very end, I will just ask a few prompts that of course we can't discuss one-to-one, but I've created a Padlet so that you can go and enter your thoughts in if you would like to share them with me. And of course there's absolutely no pressure to do this, but I'm very keen to hear what others think of these ideas, so please do feel free to share your ideas in that way if you would like. And in fact, you might find it useful to have a notebook with you as you go through, because there will be a series of questions and prompts and opportunities for reflection throughout, and you can capture your ideas as you go along and then come to the Padlet at the end and share them if you feel comfortable. So I'd like you to take just a moment and think about how you would define the self. What do you think makes up the self? Or if you think that's a bit too of a distant idea, then think about yourself and what do you think makes you, you? There are many different definitions of self, both within disciplines and across disciplines. I like this one as a starter because it does think about the fact that we are biological organisms. And increasingly, people in biology, neurobiology, psychology, they are agreeing that a model like this one is probably essential to understanding the self and to understanding consciousness. And that isn't to say that these other disciplines don't have something to say, but there is this acknowledgement that because we are biological, physical creatures, it does make sense to think about how the self might have emerged as something that does help us to undertake the basic life regulation functions associated with an organism. Of course, most of us live around other people, and so it doesn't really make sense to think about the self as being something all on its own, but rather it is it's related to an organism that was created by other organisms, that was raised by other organisms, that lives in a society or a community around other organisms, and through that close relationship is impacted by those other organisms and of course impacts them in turn. And so if you look more at sociological and psychological definitions of self, we often bring in the term identity and link these things together and recognize that there's a whole aspect of self that's not just about the evolutionary, the biological, it's also about these relationships that we have and the culture that we have. And this can obviously manifest quite differently in different cultures, this process of interacting with others. So roughly speaking, you might see differences between East and West, Indigenous versus European, and so on. And so, of course, we see that different cultures have different understandings of self and how much it's intertwined with other beings. But in general, most cultures do recognize that when we're thinking about the self, at least one way of defining that is by looking at the different sorts of roles that we would take on, the relationships that we have, the activities that we undertake. And this is another way to think about what it is to be a self. There are various traits that biologists and psychologists and philosophers and sociologists and so on would measure, and these are all about the flavor of being the particular self that you are. And these are just the tip of the iceberg, and I think that these also help to give us a real sense of what is a particular self. Not necessarily what is self in general, but what is your version of a self. I do like to think of this as being your flavor of a self, of a person. And so you can think about things like your disposition, your temperament, the personality, how consistent you are over time, the values that you have, but also things not listed here that might include your habits, your preferences, your style, your presence, all sorts of things that, you know, if someone were to see you from a distance, if they were to hear a story about a person, they would immediately think, ah, that's that particular self, that's that person that I know. So there are lots of other characteristics as well that we might relate to the self, either formally or informally. At the end of the day, I actually think it is a little bit of an academic exercise to define the self. It is really important to be able to contextualize. So to say, for example, yes, I recognize that my understanding of self is slightly different from someone else's. I think that mine is perhaps a bit more Western or a bit more Eastern, or whatever you need to do so that people can understand what is your approach and what are your boundaries, and would this therefore be useful to them. But at the end of the day, I think that really you should find your own definition. You will have your own questions, you will have your own explorations, and as long as you can explain what those are, then your definition of self is as good as anyone else's. For my purposes, I think that when I'm undertaking self-study, really what's in boundary for me is the sort of stuff that Nagel was thinking of whenever he was asking the question, what is consciousness? And so you may be familiar with his essay where he said, well, what's it like to be a bat? And because we can actually say, yeah, I could imagine putting myself in a bat's body and thinking about what it's like to be a bat, well, that probably means that that bat has consciousness, just like we have consciousness. There's an experience that it's like to be a particular thing. And for me, I kind of think of that as a good way to think about self as well. What is it like to be me? And if I am studying that, then I am undertaking self-study. So that's really the way that I approach all of this research. So following on from that, I am actually now going to dive in and ask a series of questions, a series of prompts, a series of reflections to help you start to think about what is it like to be you. And when we did this in the original session, we had a mentee and we did it live. But obviously you can't do it in quite the same way. So I am going to go through the questions and show you some of the answers so that you can pause and answer for yourself, and then perhaps compare and see where you relate to the folks who came before. So the first question I'll ask is, what is the locus of your decision making? And you can interpret this question the way that you like. Many of the people in the original session interpreted it differently than how I intended, but actually it became really interesting to see what their answers were. So when you are making a decision, where do you think the knowledge and understanding comes from? Where do you think the impetus to respond in a certain way comes from? Here are the responses that I received live in the session. Now, only one person interpreted this in the way that I intended. So I was thinking, when you are making decisions, are you thinking with your head? Are you thinking with your heart? Is it your instincts and your gut? Is it the knowledge that you have in your head that you're drawing on? And you can see that one person did mention rationality. So that's someone who apparently is thinking with their head. But there were many other things as well. So you can see that there are folks who are thinking about relationships and context. There's someone who's thinking about the particular situation itself. What does it feel like? So how do I then respond to that one? And I quite liked this because it really did show me that the question was a bit leading, I guess, in some respects, and I had a very narrow understanding. But this does reveal that when we are making decisions, we might be taking into account many different things. So it might be ourselves, it might be others, it might be where we are and what we're doing at a given time. And this is quite a lot of variety just in a relatively small group of people. So the next question I asked was, what is your approach when you cook? And I actually offered a series of choices and people could select which one was right for them. So for you, you can just think, oh, okay, generally, what is it that I'm doing? Am I using a recipe? Am I not using a recipe? Do I actually even cook at all, or do I prefer to eat out? What is the general ethos that you take into the kitchen, assuming you go into the kitchen, whenever you are thinking about making a meal? And here again, you can see the responses of the folks from the original session. So nobody said that they followed a recipe exactly. Others said that they used a recipe for inspiration. You've got more people saying actually they just look to see what they've got and then they run with that. And then one person admitted that they would rather just use Deliveroo or some other service to help them out. There was a little bit of discomfort perhaps, or uncertainty about why I was asking this question, and I will pick this back up a little bit later on, but I asked these questions that I deliberately thought about a range of things to ask, specifically because I did want people to think about different habits that they have, different ways of being that they have. So I promise there is a method to this madness. My next question was about organization, and this is one that had sliders so that people could rank how they felt about a given statement. And I had 3 different statements. So this question really was just to get people thinking about to what extent do they plan their day, to what extent do they pull their ideas together, and how do they pull their ideas together, and how do they kind of keep themselves on track and working efficiently. Again, you can see the answers here. Most people did tend to sort of cluster into a particular area in each of these questions. So you can see, for example, with the top one, everyone's kind of there at the high end. In the middle, everyone's kind of at the low end. There was a bit of a dichotomy there. In the third question, we did have kind of 2 groups of people at either end a little bit. But you can see that there is some variation even though people are clustering around a particular part of the spectrum. So different people have different ideas about how to be organized and how to go through their day. Now switching gears entirely, the next question I asked was, what makes you feel awe? And this was a question I asked because I've been doing some reading lately and found that there's some interesting research on how feeling awe can make us feel happy. It can help us to be more mindful and to be in the moment. It can help us to put things into context. It can help us to find purpose in our lives. And it's in a range of ways, it's quite good for well-being. It can kind of reset the brain. And so I thought this would be a really interesting question to ask people. Where do they encounter this sort of feeling, and how can they bring this feeling onto themselves if they're aware of this and they could go out and seek these things out? So what makes you feel awe? Here you can see some of the answers we got in the group. There are folks, quite a lot of folks who were thinking about nature in various ways, but also some of the research that they do, the relationships they have, and so on. So there are lots of people who feel awe in different ways or in different variations on a particular theme. The final question I asked was one that had to do with rankings, and that's hard to do unless you can actually see the things that you're trying to rank. So I've just gone ahead and shown you the results here on the screen. On the left, you can see the first question. I separated these out, and this one has to do with values that typically are associated with personal decision making. And on the right, you can see a list that is typically associated with professional decision making. Now, obviously, these are not actually in real life only found in one situation or another. This is just from surveys of people. When do they tend to mention these values? And you can see that often they tend to fall into these categories. So I was asking people just to think about not necessarily their overall most important values, which we will come to later on, but just in general, if you're looking at those different things, how would you rank them? And this reflects the fact that when we're in a given situation, there are going to be lots of things we're trying to take into account at once. We're trying to balance them all out. And so even if you actually think, well, I do value courage, I think it's really important, that there are going to be times when perhaps you do have to look at everything and say, you know what, in this particular situation, I think maybe respect trumps that. So it was just getting people to think, okay, on average, how would you relate these in with respect to each other? And is it difficult to make that decisions? And often it is quite difficult to think about your values and to really put a name to these things that drive the decisions that you make. We don't often take the time to think about that. So that's what I was trying to prompt here. So coming out of that exercise, or that series of exercises, what I asked the group was, had you ever thought about any of these things before? And how much do you think they say about yourself or your identity? How important do you think that these things or things like them are for your experience of life, for what it's like to be you? And people did say that they thought some of that was interesting, that no, they hadn't necessarily thought of that, and it was kind of intriguing to compare with other people. We had a group of about a dozen or so, and just within that group you could see quite a lot of variation. However, when I asked them to what extent they thought that those sorts of things could relate to positionality and might therefore influence work that they do in decolonization or other social justice activities, they weren't really convinced. They said, well, you know, it's all kind of well and good, but that all seems a bit fluffy. I'm not really sure that this was actually a good use of my time if you're specifically thinking about trying to get me to think, you know, what is my positionality and how can I go change the world? So I would like to see if perhaps I can convince you now that this is actually a line of inquiry that can be quite fruitful. I'd like to start that off by, first of all, giving you a chance to think about positionality. So how would you define this word? It is a word that we use all the time in the context of social justice, in the context of education, in the context of research. And yet, if you look into the literature, there are tons of definitions, and actually they can be quite different, and it can be very difficult to think, which of those do I agree with most? Which of those is most relevant? Do all of these things fit together? So take a moment and think, what do you think positionality is? Here is one definition of positionality, and I think this one does reflect and capture what was emerging from the discussion in the original session. So folks were really talking about position and power and thinking about what that means for access. So they were saying then, if you're thinking about position and power and access, the sorts of things we were talking about, how do you cook, how do you organize yourself, that really has nothing to do with this. Another definition is this one here, and I do not think that this is in conflict with the first one. I think that it just expands on it and uses some extra terms and starts to be a bit more specific. So this one is thinking about degrees of privilege, and then it's thinking about some of the factors, some of the many factors that might influence those degrees of privilege. So here you've got things like race, class, educational attainment, income, ability, gender, citizenship, and so on. And I'm going to go into this in a moment in a bit more detail, but I think already you can start to see, well, wait a minute, maybe some of those questions I was asking actually could relate to this. So educational attainment, for example, how might educational attainment be impacted by the answers to the question that I gave about organization, for instance? Now I know, of course, in the society that we live in, there are particular structures that will influence whether people have access to education. So I'm not saying that the question I was asking is the only reason, but I'm saying that there might be a relationship there that could be interesting and useful to explore. And the third definition, or the third exploration that I would like to add to the mix here is this final one here at the bottom. Some aspects of positionality are culturally ascribed or generally regarded as being fixed. So you can see a list there that relates to the quotation above. Others, such as political views, personal life history, and experiences, are more fluid, subjective, and contextual. And I think that this section in bold, and in particular the thing about experiences, and actually personal life history as well, I think that starts to get more at the crux of what I'm interested in, because I think the sorts of questions that I was asking begin to get people to think about what is their personal experience? What is it like to be them? How do they navigate through life? And how do all of those tiny little things, those little things that we don't necessarily pay attention to on a day-by-day basis, how do those nudge us in one direction or another? How do they set us up to have a certain type of experience, to interact with others in a particular way, to follow through on expectations and to live up to expectations that others have or to not. So I actually think that these aspects listed here at the very end, kind of as a throwaway almost, not found in those other definitions, I think that these can be really important. I'm not saying that they're the only important thing, but I think that they can be important and they can be quite a rich mine of data for us to go into and start to explore. So I think it's probably worth at this point my stating explicitly what I think positionality is. And really what I would say is that I think that it's all of those definitions we saw on the previous slide and more. Because I do come from a different field originally and have always worked in a transdisciplinary way, I think that I do have this tendency to take all of the best parts of definitions from across all these different fields and join them together in sort of a new meta definition that I feel, and I know I could be wrong, but I feel it's slightly more universal. The way that I see positionality is not something that's just about power. It's not just about access. It's about absolutely everything. And I see all people as being sort of in-dimensional organisms in a big in-dimensional cloud. And so there we are with all of these huge number, infinite number of traits that we have. And every day, those traits will change slightly. Actually, moment by moment, I would say those traits change slightly. And this results from what I think self is and how self is created. And intersectionality is in there as well. And so I think that we have all of these different traits, whether they have to do with the color of our eyes, the length of our hair, our height, our religion, our gender, all the simple stuff, all the way to the super complicated stuff. I think that all of that positions us somewhere. And those positions might change, some of them might stay the same, but we're in this vast galaxy of traits. And I think that positionality is where we are in that vast galaxy of traits. So it's how all of those traits come together to create the you that you are, as well as what the implications of that are. So if you have that particular grouping of traits, what does that mean about where you sit in society and how that influences your movement and interactions with others? So having established that idea about positionality, let's revisit some of the Menti questions. What is the locus of your decision making? Now, I think that this one actually is, this perhaps does relate more strongly to kind of a traditional understanding of positionality. You can see that there are some perhaps more Western or Eurocentric understandings here. So someone's thinking about rationality, someone else is thinking about your perspective. So perhaps these are folks who are thinking about, kind of the mind-body dualism and using their brains and thinking hard, and that's where you make a decision. But then there are other folks who have thought about relationships and context and situation and feeling, and that perhaps is, again, to be to oversimplify and to generalize, but that's perhaps more of a global South perspective, a more indigenous perspective. So you can see that the way that you make decisions might actually reflect a certain community view that you've come from, a certain society, a certain worldview, and that is all something that might be very closely related to a sort of traditional understanding of positionality. So here's a really silly question, right? How do you cook? What's your approach to cooking? But I think that a question like this, you can really start to extrapolate and think about, well, what does this mean about my personality? What does this mean about my habits? So you could actually be thinking, I realize that I absolutely have to use a recipe. I cannot go in that kitchen and cook without a recipe. And maybe that's because I really care about preserving tradition. Maybe that's because, yeah, I could innovate, but I think it's really important to keep doing this exactly how my grandma did it or how my great-grandmother did it. And so actually that starts to say something about not just cooking, but about your relationships with other people and how you think culturally. You might also be thinking about, the amount of flexibility or adaptiveness that you can start to see. And so it's not just about wanting to preserve your great-grandmother's recipe, but maybe it's about just how comfortable you feel doing something different. And you could think, well, what might that mean if I meet someone from a new culture who is really different? Or what does that mean if things suddenly change around me? We give different people permissions to do different things, and that's, I don't know, I've not been used to that before. I'm quite uncomfortable. So what does that mean about how you might relate to certain things that happen in society? And all of that then starts to make you think about your positionality and how your positionality might manifest. Again, with the question, what are your approaches to organization? You can take a step back and not just think about these exact questions, but what do they mean? So how rhizomatic is your thinking? How much do you go with the flow? What do you think about collaborators who are not like you? So if you act in a particular way and you have to have to work with someone who's not like that, what's that going to be like? Are you going to be tolerant to that? Are you going to expect certain things? What do your expectations and assumptions mean? Are there going to be certain judgments because of that and perhaps certain biases? So what does that mean then about how you interact with these colleagues? So all of this stuff can seem quite trivial or shallow, but actually have really important effects on day-to-day interactions. And they can also say something a bit more general about just how you approach the world itself. So this question really picks up on that in particular. And I think this is really important to think to yourself, how often do I feel humble? Do I believe in a deity or deities? What is my religious or spiritual belief? And how does that impact, how I see the world and how I interact with others? when and where and how do I get a sense of being part of something larger if I do at all? Maybe you never feel maybe you never feel that, you're just a tiny being in a much bigger universe around you. What impact does that have? Or if you feel that all the time, what impact does that have? So what do all of these sorts of things mean about your larger worldview and therefore your approach to various issues and to various people and to various contexts? And that question is picked up here in this one as well, because it's allowing you to think, in those different contexts, how am I making decisions in the moment? And how does that influence the people around me? Do others around you have similar rankings, and why or why not? And what are the tensions if they don't? Where did those values even come from to begin with? Why would you rank them in that way? And what does that mean then about the outcomes of interactions with other people? What does that mean about how or whether you get access to certain opportunities and to to the privileges that you have? And actually some of these things may be a result of privilege. Maybe it's easy for you to be able to care about some of these things rather than others because you haven't been in circumstances where other traits actually and other values were more important and were able to help you to get along better and to interact with fellow people. So all of these, again, are things that can relate to issues of standard definitions of positionality, as well as perhaps the more broad and universal one that I've suggested as well. So coming back then to this question I originally asked of what is positionality? And do we think that actually those silly questions that I started with could begin to help you grapple with that? Maybe now you're thinking, okay, they don't seem quite as silly. Maybe they could. And hopefully, like me, you're beginning to think actually what those sorts of questions could do is to help me position myself in that in-dimensional cloud so that I can see at this time and place at least, here is where I am, here is where I fall, here are all the different traits that I have or that I'm aware of anyway, and here is what that might start to mean. Who are the other people around me that I'm going to bump into over here? What happens if I'm interacting with people who are way far away and actually it's going to be really hard for me to figure out their understandings and their attitudes because we are in such different positions. And so I would suggest, as you can see, as I have been doing, that all of those little questions, basically everything we do in life, you can extrapolate from that and start to see little patterns. And those little patterns can help you to understand where you sit, and understanding where you sit can help you to see all the different effects that that has on the people around you, the way that you navigate through the world, and the way that you can then have an impact in this very niche context that we're discussing here on social justice, on things like decolonization or doing equity work and so on. So I would say that all these little things we can look at can be meaningful because they help to just slightly clarify our understanding of where we sit in this cloud and what that means. With that, we can now dive into trialing some of the self-study techniques that I have brought together for this session. Now, of course, there are many, many self-study techniques. I have just brought together 5 because these are things that I think we can do in a context like this. There are many more that you can do on your own or you can do in pairs or in small groups. So at the end, there is going to be an opportunity. There's going to be a Padlet link. So if there are other things that you're aware of or that you've done yourself, that you've heard of, that you think would be quite useful, please do feel free to share those because this is just the tip of the iceberg here. So the first technique I'd like to look at is scenario cards. And this is a specific tool. You can see a picture of it there that I have purchased from the internet. They did a Kickstarter a few years ago, and they've just recently had a whole second deck or set of decks released because they were so popular and they got so much attention. And I was fascinated by this because I have noticed that there is a proliferation of card decks like these that are meant to help people to do various things. So there are some that are meant to help you reflect. There are others that are meant to tell your future, that are meant to motivate you, that are meant to help you do creative projects like writing and so on. People seem to love a deck. And because this is something that's so commercially available and so popular, I thought, well, it's interesting then to explore, do these things actually have any value or is it just kind of a gimmick? So I bought this particular set, or these two sets, because I actually did read through some examples and I thought, those are interesting questions and those could be quite intriguing to explore. And they come in a variety of different themes and kind of different levels of intensity. So if there are things where you think, actually this might be a bit sensitive, or I just want something kind of light and fun, I don't want something really deep, you can choose what's appropriate for you at a given time. And you can use these on your own. You can use them as kind of the silly ones you could do at a party if you really wanted to. You could do them in a classroom setting or for research purposes, out loud and writing and so on. So they're very flexible. And what I've got on the next slide is a selection of questions that I pulled out to use with the folks who were at the original session. I got them into breakout groups, into little pairs, so that they could take turns selecting questions and responding to each other. And actually, they did find this to be really interesting. They thought that some of these questions were unusual, unexpected, and it did make them start to think. So hopefully you will find the same. Now I'm going to pause in just a moment and pull up all the slides for you to look at. And if you would like to go through some of those questions, then you can do that. You can pause the PowerPoint, you can answer the questions as much as you like, and then you can come back and start again. So here is your selection of 8 scenario card questions taken from the different decks and the different themes and the different intensities. Some of them are a bit silly, some of them perhaps are a bit more in-depth. So you can pause here and answer these if you like. The next technique that I introduced was one that sort of harkened back to the Menti survey at the very beginning. And this wasn't just getting people to rank any random 5 values that I happened to give them, but it was to ask them to actually sit and think, what are your personal values? And this is something that I've done in several different sessions with different people working through different contexts. And what's intriguing to me is the fact that almost always there's at least one person who says, I thought that I kind of knew what my values were, or at least that I had values, but I'd never been asked to actually come up with the words themselves. And doing that was really hard because I did have to really sort through and think about what's the most accurate description and how would I rank these and so on. So hopefully you will have a chance to do that now if you haven't already. And if you have thought about what are your important values, maybe the second step of rearranging them in order of priority, sort of like that first Menti exercise, is something that you might not have done before, so that might be a bit of a new spin. Now, for anyone who has not thought about their values in the past, you can go online and find long lists of different values, but you can also just ask yourself questions like, well, how do I like to be treated? What do I want to be remembered for? What do I think makes for a good life and for good behavior towards others? And those are the sorts of things that can help you to think, right, okay, if I think that I want to be remembered for being kind, then probably kindness is one of my top 5 personal values. So you can narrow in on your own values in that way, and you can put them in that priority list overall. Now, of course, acknowledging that sometimes there will be contextual differences. Perhaps as you do this, you can also think, where have these come from? Have I come up with these myself? Do I do this because my parents have taught me this, because I learned it in school? It can be really interesting to think about where your values come from. And you can also think, well, how does this relate to what we did earlier in that Menti? And if you did write down some notes, you can go back and compare. Are any of those same traits in there? Have you prioritized them in the same way? The third technique that we went through is one that was inspired by some research by a Japanese colleague in Canada who is studying ikigai. And ikigai is this Japanese philosophical concept about what is the value of life, what makes life worth living. And this colleague was really interested in comparing the ikigai reflections of students in Japan, and what do young people think of as being their own ikigai, what makes life worth living, but then also thinking, is that any different from what he sees with his students in Canada? So there's some great research coming out of his work, comparing these different responses across these cultures, and also thinking in particular, because he is someone who specializes in leisure studies, thinking, are people getting these sorts of experiences at work? Are they getting them in their off time when they're having fun? Where is meaning in life coming from? So one of his techniques was to get the students to go off and find a photograph of when they were really happy. So that might be when they were at school, it might be at university, it might be when they're on holiday, it could be anything. And he said, find a photograph that showed you really happy, really showed you having a value in life. And think about that. Think about why. So really study that image and try to kind of mentally place yourself back in that moment and think about, why was that experience so enjoyable? And did that relate to, my values in life, my goals in life, my aspirations? Did it have to do with the roles that I have and the relationships? Perhaps there were other people in the photograph. Perhaps there's a particular connection that you have, not with people, but with the place and with the landscape. And how does the experience reflect or relate to just your general sense of identity? So kind of bringing together the roles you have, the values, the place, the experiences, and so on. So now you can do that same thing yourselves. You can pause this video, you can go find a photograph, you can reflect on that photograph, and you can think, what does this tell me about myself? And how might I use that knowledge of myself? What does that tell me that I didn't know? How could I harness that in some fashion? How could that actually be something challenging? How could that present a barrier? What do I learn from seeing and inspecting this aspect of myself? And just before I send you off, I thought it might be helpful if I shared an example of my own in case this is sort of a weird exercise. So here's a picture that I took while I was in Ireland, and I was on holiday on my own. I was supposed to go with a friend and then that fell through, but I went on my own anyway, and I was able to just drive around the whole country doing whatever I wanted in the moment. And it turned out that what I wanted to do was look for all of these different stone circles and visit them and see what they felt like, see what they looked like, take photographs of them, and just really embed myself in the landscape and experience that ancient landscape and those remnants of ancient culture. And that is probably the best holiday I have ever had, because I got to do exactly the thing that I was most interested in when I wanted to do it. I didn't have to negotiate with anyone. And that was fascinating to me because, a lot of people would say going on vacation alone is quite sad, it's quite boring, but I thought it was absolutely wonderful. So, clearly this says something about my own independence, but also the fact that the thing I most wanted to do was really about history and was about landscape and kind of human geographies. I didn't necessarily expect that. I'm a biologist. I'm now an educator, and that has nothing to do with those things. So there was this sort of spiritual element, I guess, that I hadn't necessarily anticipated, and it did kind of make me realize just how much I do value history and our understanding of our ancestors and embedding ourselves in a history and a long continuation of people and generations. And so that has been a really informative experience for me. And by looking back at this photograph, I can really reflect on that and think about, well, what does this mean then for what I do in the day-to-day? And what does this mean about the priorities that I have in life? So this is the sort of thing that you can do with your own photograph now. Now, this next activity is one that in the first instance is really just this is kind of like the planning stages, and I'm getting you to think about the idea of interviewing other people in order to find more about yourselves. So I'm not going to have you actually interview anyone, but what you could do after undertaking these reflections is perhaps take some of the ideas that you've thought of and then think about, actually, I could put this into practice. And so you could do a phase 2 where you do actually carry through an interview. Now, this was something that I was interested in because often we talk about how we need to get out of our own heads and do look at ourselves from the outside. And of course, one of the best ways to do that is to actually just ask for other people's opinions. In the business world, we often have these 360-degree evaluations where we get colleagues from all different aspects of the company or the university to tell us about their experiences with us and what those were like. And then we accumulate all of that and say, okay, well, what does this mean? And we kind of triangulate what all of those different opinions mean. In the research world, we might find that we do this. We look at the literature and try to disprove ourselves, or we speak to colleagues and say, well, what do you think? And we try to use their advice to nudge ourselves in a different direction. So there are many different ways, small and large, that we do try to take other people's opinions into account when we're trying to understand ourselves. And this is just a really obvious one for self-study. So what you could do here now is think about who could you interview? Who do you think would have some really interesting and intriguing and new perspectives about yourself that could help you to understand who you are? And then you could think about, well, what would each of those people help me learn about myself? So you might list your mom, you might list a teacher, you might list a best friend, you might list your boss, and each of those people are probably going to tell you very different stories and very different things. Now, they might start to have some overlaps, which would be really interesting to find, but they're probably also going to be very different examples as well. So you can have maybe a list of all these people and then think about all the different stuff from each one of them. And then within each one of those categories, you can further say, well, what questions would I ask to draw out this information that could be most helpful? So would I be asking them about just what are the traits that you see in me? Is it something like, what do you think are my strengths? Tell me an anecdote about when you thought I was most effective or I was most happy. So you could think of all sorts of different questions that you might ask to start pulling out that information that you think those folks could offer you. And then you could think, okay, depending on what they might offer, and it's kind of hard to do this completely in a theoretical manner, but you could think, I guess they would probably tell me these sorts of things or these sorts of things. What would I do with that? How would I use that information to find some patterns and to then perhaps make some changes or guide my decisions? So think about how you could take interview question knowledge and actually make that a useful, actionable form of self-study. So again, you can pause the video here and come up with a rubric that shows you all of the different answers to these different prompts. And then perhaps later on, you can actually go act on that. Now, the final self-study technique in this presentation is personal timelines. And there are two main reasons why I wanted to bring this into the mix. The first is that if you look at psychological research, increasingly, I think there is agreement that this narrative understanding that we have of ourselves is something that we very much create. And as we go through life, we look back and we start to connect the dots in a way that seems very logical, but actually that's us. We like to look for patterns, we like cause and effect, and so we kind of force that on the situation, we force that on the data, and we make it make sense. And we start doing this about when we're in adolescence, so kind of our teenage years is when we start having this personal narrative that emerges. And as we go through our lives, we get better at doing this. We do it a bit more intensely as we move into adulthood. And actually you can see that the narratives do change. And we get extra data that help us to kind of reconfigure. Actually our memories aren't as good, and so we start to reimagine things. We ascribe new meaning because some other thing happens and we think, actually, oh, I see, now I understand that. And so we reevaluate the narrative that we already had in place and so on. So it's this fascinating process that is very human. And it does seem to also be related to consciousness and how the brain is just wired to function. And I won't get into that here, but there's really amazing research on this. So that's one reason. It is kind of inherently a part of being people that we do this. So it's kind of interesting to do it on purpose. But also, in my teaching realm, this is an exercise that we do often give to students. So whether we're thinking about, what's your professional identity, or how are you going to develop as a professional, or how have you developed as a learner, we do set that as a task sometimes. We often think about learning journeys or professional journeys, for example, and when we're getting people to do portfolios of their work, we do often ask them to come up with a timeline, like, here, what are you going to do over the next 5 years? How are you going to develop? How are you going to learn? How are you going to function in your role in your job or in society? And so I think this is something that we're asked to do, so you might as well do it on your own and have a good idea of what you think that trajectory looks like. So I've suggested that what you could do here is pull out 9 things to start with. Now, of course, you can do more. You should do more if you want to, but I thought that these were kind of a nice basic set to start with. So you can create a literal timeline. It does help to draw this out. So think of at least 3 major formative milestones. Think of at least 5 minor events and at least 1 goal for the future. And you can start and finish this timeline wherever you like. So it might be your whole life, or maybe you're interested in focusing in on, kind of the next 5 years. And so it's really thinking about where you are now going into the future, or where you have been over the course of your time in higher education, for example. So you can choose the beginning and end, and then just populate in between with those 9 things. And as you do that, or once you're done, you can then reflect, how easy was that, or how challenging was that actually? Do I have a ton of seemingly relevant events, or do I have like none at all? Was it just empty in my mind? To what extent do I think that there's a cohesive narrative, or actually do I have this sense that I'm just doing a bunch of stuff and it all happens to fall together? And then you can think, well, what does that mean? My answers to those questions, what does that mean? What does that tell me about me? Now, way back at the beginning, I did say that there was going to be a Padlet. So here is that moment. I am showing you the Padlet. You can see the link there on the screen, and you can also see the QR code. And this Padlet will remain open to anyone who would like to contribute. And at this point in the original session, we had a discussion. And of course, you can't have that discussion if you are doing this asynchronously. So I wanted to create a space in which you could comment on any of the things that we've done. So you can think about the definitions we explored around self, thinking about what is self-study and what are some techniques that you would recommend beyond what we've just done here. You can think about positionality. You can provide some responses to each of the activities that we did. Was that helpful for you? Did you think that was silly? Could you actually see it being useful? And in particular, it would be great if people do have ideas about, do you think this relates to positionality? Or how do you think this relates to positionality? How could you use this in your social justice work, in your work supporting decolonization? Or could you? So this is really a place for you to actually think about all of what just happened and to really start to consolidate its value or lack thereof, its application, and so on. So please do feel free to use that and dump whatever thoughts you would like, and to see what others perhaps have said as well. As you were doing that, particularly in towards the end where it's a bit more freestyle, I have a series of columns there, so you can choose the column that's right for you. But what you can do as you're thinking about all of these different techniques is, what did it feel like to experiment with that? Did you find it fun? Did you find it interesting? Was it uncomfortable? Did it actually make you a bit hostile? Out of the 5 things that we did, was there something that you particularly enjoyed that was your favorite, and why was that? I'm really curious if anyone has learned anything interesting and new about themselves. So what I will say is that I have done each of these things myself, and with every single one of them, I have learned something new. It has changed my perspective of myself. And that is why I am a firm believer that this is important, that it does work, because I have gone through this personally and found that, as reflective as I am, forcing myself to sit down and actually do a thing rather than just kind of vaguely think, well, yeah, I know about myself. It really did put information out in front of me and make me think, wait a minute, and really understand how I might navigate through the world, and how that might affect others, and how others might perceive me, and how that could impact my work in social justice and education and research and so on. So I personally feel that all of these things are valuable, but maybe that's just me. So I'm really curious to hear if anyone else has learned something as well. And likewise, related to that, do you think that you could see yourself using any of these techniques or something similar in your own practice, or maybe sharing it with others, doing it with other people, and so on? And of course, all of that culminates in this broad question, as I already mentioned, about, you know, does this actually relate to social justice, or how does it? And is this relevant for someone like me, who teaches this sort of material? Is it relevant for me to start bringing this into the classroom more often and getting people to do this? Or is that detracting? Is that going off piece a little bit and kind of distracting people from the actual discussion that we need to be having? So I would love to have your opinions on that as well. That brings us to the end of the workshop/video. You can see at the bottom of this slide here, I've put my email address, c.r.kite@exeter.ac.uk. You are absolutely welcome at any time to get in touch with questions or comments, whether you agreed or disagreed. Perhaps you want to discuss something further. Maybe you want to share a paper. Please do get in touch, because I would love to discuss this. Even if you don't, I do hope that you learned something new about self or self-study or positionality. Maybe it made you think something different about yourself, perhaps understand yourself a little bit differently. And I would just encourage everyone to look out for these opportunities, large and small, in everyday life. There are so many things that we do or that we could do where we can learn about ourselves. So I hope that you have those opportunities and that your eyes are open to those so that you can always be engaged in some form of self-study and use that to really enhance your practice and to support your work in decolonization and social justice.